Thanks very much and good morning. I was asked to talk to you about a different kind of collaboration, a think tank or do tank as they call themselves. And in doing so, I will shift the focus from just doing clinical trials to a much broader focus. How can we chaperone the journey of a molecule or a new therapy from being a candidate all the way to the patient? So what I want to discuss very briefly is what is NEWDIGS, then what is adaptive licensing, because that impinges on what you are doing, and then in the end I'll reflect upon what types of studies or evidence generations will we need in future. So let me start with NEWDIGS. It's a funny acronym and it stands for New Drug Development Paradigms. It comes out of the MIT, who founded a couple of years ago a group called, and you find the logo down here, Centerfor Biomedical Innovation. And that was based on the realization that the innovation engine, particularly in the biopharmaceutical industry, isn't humming along as it should be. And everybody is a bit disgruntled and dissatisfied. Whether you're a patient, a pharma provider, a payer, or regulator, you have a lot of chagrins. So they came up with the idea, we set up this group, and the goal is what's written in here in that blue sphere. I will not read it out to you. Now, how did they set it up? They said, from the start, we want to make it a unique, collaborative, innovation and learning environment. It should be creative and unbureaucratic, and we borrow ideas from the old skunk works. You may be familiar with that, minus the secrecy part. We want to have a collective impact, just like Sematech had some decades ago in this country, in a different field. And we want to drain, so to speak, the entrepreneurship and collective intelligence that is available at the MIT. They said from the start, we will not look at products or a process or a group of stakeholders. We'll take a systems approach. We have to look at the co-evolution and change of processes, technologies, policies, and particularly people. And they call themselves not just a think tank, but also a do tank. They want to catalyze pilot studies in real life, not just sit and think. So who are the members of this group? You will immediately spot some of these logos. You will find regulators from different regions of the globe at the far left. There is the EMA, FDA, Health Canada. You find, in this case, Friends of Cancer, so patient organizations, big pharma, but also payers, interestingly, who realize that this is of relevance to them. So it's a very broad and diverse group. Now, they have a number of work streams, but probably the most visible product that came out from that group was a concept called adaptive licensing. And this is the front of the paper that we co-wrote within that group. And I guess the major achievement wasn't writing the paper. That was not too difficult. The major achievement was to get all these authors to sign it, because they came from a very diverse group. So you have payers in there and pharmaceutical industry, imagine that. But somehow the ideas are crystallizing. So what is that? What is this concept and why could it be important for you? Let's go back to first principles. If we develop a drug or a technology, knowledge grows over time. That is why we do experiments and then studies. So we usually follow some kind of learning curve, as I have depicted it here. It isn't always as smooth, but this is sort of schematized. And of course, as time goes by, knowledge and investment grows. Now, in our legal environment, there is an arbitrary point in time, and it is here, that we call the magic moment. That is when you get a license. Up to that day, you cannot have the drug if you are a patient unless you're in a clinical trial. Next morning, it's out the door. Anyone can prescribe, anyone can have it. So is that wise? And that is our problem as regulators. If you read the press about regulators, there are those who say, come on, you are making drug development unstable. You should lower the entrance barrier. You should come to the left. Patients sometimes tell us, why do we have to wait 13 years for a new drug? We want them now. That's one side. On the other hand, you get the likes of consumer advocates. What is it, publiccitizen.org, and those people who say, no, you want to move to the right. You want to up the ante. We need to know everything about a drug before we can let it out the door. So this is where we are caught. And I think the best way to describe this was done by Margaret Hamburg, the current commissioner. There are only two speeds. We are too fast, and at the same time, we are too slow. And there is very little way out of that conundrum if you live in that magic moment system. So could we do better? Here is again my knowledge growth curve. Here is the magic moment. And the question is, this is the out-of-the-box thinking, can we do away with the magic moment? Can we just delete it, and instead create a number of milestones where we look at data analysis repeatedly in time and then align the way a drug becomes available to patients with the growing knowledge. As uncertainty is progressively reduced, we could broaden the axis. So here is the definition as it is in that paper. And it is a bit long, sorry. It is a definition that was made by a committee. That's what you would expect. So it is a prospectively planned, and please, prospectively planned is the keyword here, because we have been flexible in many ways. For example, Avastin was certainly flexible on the part of the FDA, but it wasn't exactly planned. So can you plan this, an adaptive approach to the regulation of drugs? You foresee iterative phases of evidence gathering, that's what we do, and always followed by regulatory evaluation in real time, and then license adaptation. Adaptation could mean up or down, whatever the evidence may be. So the goal here is to seek to maximize the positive impact of a new drug on public health by balancing this, or I will call it squaring the circle, this impossible conundrum. Timely access on one hand and full information on the other hand. So it's basically the trade-off between access and knowledge. This is not an entirely new idea, of course. In this country, you have called a pathway to market that's called accelerated approval. And the philosophy behind that is exactly that. But I would say that is a nucleus on which we could build. The CMA is the European counterpart. It stands for Conditional Marketing Authorization. We now have existing pharmacovigilance tools, REMS you have in this country. We call them RMS. So all these tools could be put to use. We're not starting from zero. But there is some difference just with the regulatory pathway. We understand today that the journey of that drug from candidate to patient is not just being driven and decided by regulators. Wish it were, I'm a regulator. No, there are payers right behind us who make coverage decisions. And then there are prescribers who make their decisions and patients. So there is a lot of decision nodes along that line. And this concept can only fly if you think it through, if those decisions are becoming aligned. Let me show you in a conceptualized way how this could pan out. And for a start, I encourage you to look just at the top left-hand panel. What you see is the classic model. And I would say oncology is probably the difference, a bit different, but think of cardiovascular drugs, Alzheimer drugs. What you do is in red, a company does phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So on the y-axis is numbers of patients exposed to a drug. On the x-axis is time. So you have your classic development path. And then suddenly there is that vertical line, the license. And then, as I said earlier, the number of treated patients explodes, because that is why companies have a sales force. They go out and they have only one order, and that is sell. So the number explodes, and what happens to those patients? Do we know? Well, in some cases now, over the past years, we have learned to oblige companies to do something like registries. The classic example would be thalidomide. We have a very strict registry. You couldn't get in Europe thalidomide unless you are on a registry. We want to know what happened to you, that you aren't getting pregnant, etc. But that is the exception to the rule. The majority of patients fall under that light blue space, and basically that means we have no idea what happens to these patients. Are these patients cured? Are they harmed by the drug? We simply don't know. And that is not intelligent. So can we look at an alternative scenario? And I now encourage you to look at the bottom left diagram. Looks very similar in the beginning. You could even have fewer RCTs, so that red box is a bit lower. You don't have to have 10,000 patients for perhaps a cardiovascular study. And you could theoretically allow it out a little earlier. This is the part that industry likes. Well, good, we'll make a revenue earlier. But there is a back end to this. And that is the condition that if you allow it out, A, you continue to do RCTs to the extent possible. And I know this is a debate, this is worth a debate because there are caveats here. I will not go in for reasons of time. But also, you will somehow force or gently nudge, the word force is not for popular, so nudge everybody in the system to ensure that we capture the treatment experience. So we have real learning systems. We will get back how these patients fare, and they are now under that yellow space, which means that we observe their fate. And then, depending on how things go, and basically at this first point in time, you make a contract between the company and the regulator, and ideally also with the payers, depending on the opportunities in a given healthcare environment. So you make a contract, and then in X years, 2 years, 3 years, whenever the case may be, you look at the data that accrued and say, okay, now we modify the license. We could relax conditions, or actually we could more restrict them, depending on the data. So that's the basic idea. What some people have said, okay, fine. So what you're having here is an RCT phase in the beginning. Nothing has changed. But then you're complementing the RCT with an observational phase. These patients do not necessarily have to be in an interventional study. They could be. Look at the red part here. So there are still RCTs running, but many will be in an observational study, a registry, for example, or simply you use the electronic medical record information. So that brings me to my last point that I want to make. What types of studies, or let's call it broader evidence generation, is needed in future? So look at this as a teaser. I think everyone who graduated in medicine, at least around the time when I did, must be familiar with this. You know what that is. That was the mantra of the evidence-based movement. The Cochrane collaboration came up with this. It's called the hierarchy of evidence. So the top, of course, is the RCT, or meta-analysis of RCT, and then you come down in sort of evidence hierarchy to non-randomized studies. And at the very bottom, you find then experience and opinions. So, fine. Where are we in the regulatory community? Which of these do we usually take into account? Well, very clearly, this. This is the mainstay of drug regulation. I would say oncology is actually the only exception. I could not imagine a cardiovascular drug getting a license based on a non-randomized single-arm trial. That wouldn't happen. So I set oncology slightly aside, or an Alzheimer drugs. It is always an RCT or several RCTs. This is where we're strong. This is what we know how to interpret. And interestingly, we're also strong at the very bottom. That isn't just a typographic error, the case series. Many decisions, regulatory decisions, are based on case series. You know what the AERS is in the US? This is where physicians write in, I think I observed an adverse event from a drug. These are essentially case series. And we get those, we analyze those, and then sometimes we'll put a black box warning in or even withdraw a drug based on such case series. And then, of course, we're all very strong at the very bottom here. We all have expert committees, and you have your advisory committees, and we have similar things. So this is our two domains. Where we're completely lacking in the regulatory field is that middle ground. And I grew up, if a study isn't randomized, your life is too short to read it, forget it. Well, I have colleagues in my organization who say, if a study is an RCT, it's totally irrelevant for practical life. Your life is too short, don't read it. Well, I think we will have to reconcile those two extreme positions. So I'd argue in future, we will have to need to take use of all these methodologies. Here is an observational study that was published, I think, last year. You can read the bigs for yourself. That came out of Medco data. They just looked at how is a drug utilized. You don't find that information in an RCT because there concomitant medication is strictly controlled. Let the drug out the door, and this is what happens. Is it relevant in terms of effectiveness of how the drug will pan out in real life? Yes, of course it is. Yes, of course we need to have that information. So, what we need is not just the front end, the RCTs to do them in a better way. That's all fine, and I'm not disputing a bit of this. But we also have to look at the back end. We need rapid learning systems, and the NEWDIGS group is now collaborating with ASCO to do a pilot and look at something that may not be the newest of the new. You look at the association of cardiotoxicity with the use of adriamycin. That has been around when I was a medical student. And they started to look at data in one hospital, and they want to broaden this. And the purpose is could that help decision-making of physicians? And how can they correlate that with RCD data? So it's a minor starting point, but I think it could be a useful pilot for more to come. Let me conclude. And I have two sets of conclusions. One is about collaborations, because you asked I should talk about a collaboration between stakeholders. I think they can be very effective in stimulating innovation, not only in the technology field, but also as this one in the policy field. And the reason is that usually if you get change driven from a single silo, and we talked a lot about silos, I heard that word quite often. If one silo says we should go this way, the other silo will immediately say, no, no, that wasn't invented here, sorry, we're not going there. So bring them together in the first place, and you could probably have more success than otherwise. And with regards to the future of drug development, and I don't say development, I don't say license. To me, this is a continuum, developing, licensing, and market entry, meaning coverage. I think that will require more than just RCTs. We have to have the full spectrum of evidence generation methodologies at our disposal. And we will need rapid learning systems, particularly in oncology, where you get, and I listened to the talks yesterday and this morning, I sometimes wonder, my God, you guys have probably more variables than you got patients. So it's actually in this situation, the more learning you can get, the more information you can gather from the real world, the faster the learning experience will be. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, keeping with our theme of innovation and partnerships, now I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa McShane from the NCI Division of Cancer Treatment and Diagnosis. And Lisa is going to talk to us about accelerating innovation in statistical design.